Welcome to Jews on Film. My name is Harry Adensasser. I am one of the Jews on Filmans. And joining me, as always, is my co-host, Daniel Zana.
Thanks, Harry. I'm Daniel Zana. I'm a video editor, documentary filmmaker, also a Jew. Our guest today is a contributing editor at Jewish Philanthropy and a TV columnist for the Jewish News of Northern California. She's also one of the hosts of The Bagel Report, a podcast about Jews and entertainment. Esther Kustanowitz, welcome to Jews on Film.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. I don't often get a chance to talk about film specifically because I mostly talk about television, and we can talk more about why I'm mostly preferring TV these days. But I'm really always happy for the excuse to kind of sit with a film and let it just kind of marinate in my own brain juices and see what we come up with. So.
Yeah. I mean, in this case, we had 2.5 hours to sit and marinate with the film. Today, we'll be discussing The Fabelmans, directed by a small filmmaker you may have heard of called Steven Spielberg. And
he's up and coming.
Yes, definitly up and coming.
Not many people know about him yet, but you guys are in the know.
You heard it here
but
first.
An electrifying debut, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah. Not bad for a first outing.
Yeah.
Before we dive into the film, you know, we often ask a few questions, but this is kind of a special episode. At least for me, this was, I want to say this was maybe my first film kind of in this whatever era we are in right now. It's been my first like in-person theater going experience for a while. So I kind of wanted to talk about how that experience was for everyone. I went with past guest of the show, Yuli Mazanovsky, to a place up here in Seattle. And I think there were maybe 15 people in the theater. It was a Saturday night showing, and it was good to see it on the big screen. Yeah. I don't know. How about you, Harry, Esther? What were your experiences like?
I think Steven would have wanted you to see it on the big screen, so I'm glad you did that for him.
First name basis, huh?
Why not? He's mishpacha, he's family, you know?
Sure.
He's ours. He's Sammy. He's Shmuel.
Right.
So I think, you know, so for me, I had been to a number of movies before. I still remember the first movie I went back after COVID was Black Widow, and there were like 8 people in the theater, and that was it. And I was like, this is great because like if there's only 8 people in the theater, I can still go back to the movies. But you know, obviously they've become more crowded since. And the theater I went to was actually the theater on the Upper West Side because I was in New York when I saw this film. And it was like the corner almost where I used to live on the Upper West Side. So that was like really kind of like a homecoming, which I think is very much in keeping with the tenor of the film, which is really Steven Spielberg kind of going back to his roots. So I felt like there was a parallel there of sorts. Was it
a packed house?
It was pretty crowded.
Okay.
You know, it wasn't empty for sure. And I was reminded how old that theater is because the seats are really not comfortable anymore. Oh. And I remember when it was new. So,
yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Harry, how about you?
Amazing. Yeah, I was telling you this before, Daniel, but I want to say this might be my 5th movie I saw in theaters this month. So I've been back. I've been enjoying getting to the theaters. This definitely was a great crowd theater. And I'll say, like, I've gone to a bunch of movies, obviously, since we started going back in this whole COVID era. And I've done a couple that I was alone. I recently went to a movie where it was myself. And then I had a friend, I would call him, a couple rows ahead of me who would, loudly interject every so often, just so I wouldn't feel so alone. So that was nice. But in this movie, I really felt like it's a Spielberg film, so we're not going to add anything that hasn't been said about his ability to just tell an amazing, engaging audience, feel good story. But it was great to be in a theater with just a lot of laughter. That was definitely a big marker of our screening, and just a lot of engagement and a lot of, people, I think, connecting at the right moment. So that really enhanced my experience. And I want to turn this into a sort of question for you, Esther, because, you mentioned that you've been a little bit more into TV lately than movies. And, we're talking about how this experience was really marked by the theatrical experience of it all and what that means. But can you expand a little bit on what you meant, what's going on in TV right now that's different, and, why could a movie like this, or could this story have been better suited to that?
Well, far be it for me to tell us Steven Spielberg where his creative products should live.
When he listens to this, maybe he'll send us some fan mail in response.
Or next time I see him at Shul, he came to Ikar services for Rosh Hashanah, and he read the New Colossus, which is that Emma Lazarus poem that's on the base of the Statue of Liberty, as from the Bima. And they just called him up. They're like, can we have Steven up here? And my friend and co-host for the Bagel Report, Erin Ben Moshe, was sitting next to me, and she was like, Steven. And I was like, why? Do you know Steven? And she was like, Esther, Steven. And I was like, because everybody was wearing masks, and he was just this old Jewish guy on the Bima. So like, what did I know? But apparently. Anyway, that's awesome. I'll tell him next time I'm in Shul, like where his creative products should live. But in general, one of the things that has really captured my interest about television is both that there's more opportunities with the central characters so that we get to know them a little bit better. Mm-hmm. And we also get to know the world that they live in better as well. So if a character in a film is Jewish, they have to establish it either right away or it's blink and you miss it. And this was kind of, obviously being Jewish is a very, very big part of the Spielberg story. And I guess we'll get into that when we talk about the content of the movie itself. But I really enjoy the deepening of the characters, where there's a character who emerges with a bit of wisdom or a center of meaning that's based in Judaism. We see a lot of it in like supernatural style TV shows where they can always pull out a Dybbuk or a golem or something that, which is it's fun, but it can be just monster of the week unless they couch it in a story where there's a family tradition and, there's, persecution that the family always remembers, but that they have protection, that they can protect themselves. And so that's why the golem's in their family. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for anchoring characters in Jewish concepts and life in general, and customs and calendar moments and all of that, that you don't always get in films, especially if it's not supposed to be a quote unquote Jewish story. Obviously, Yentl is a little Jewy. The Frisco Kid, you can do all that stuff, but it has to be part of the character from the beginning. Otherwise, it seems like it comes out of nowhere.
Absolutely. I'm just waiting for my Uncle Boris miniseries, my 8-part miniseries. I would watch that in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
I totally. I want to see him as a young kid, going to the exactly. I want to see that. I feel like we were robbed of that story, and I want to see more of that. So it's like Nightmare Alley, but starring him. Sure, let's go with that. Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard good things.
Well, there you go.
I think that's so interesting because it really, and obviously you were saying it in the context of this film that we watched, The Fabelmans, but I was definitely trying to figure that out the whole time. Where does the Jewishness exist in this story? Is it just context? Is it part of his life? It's definitely present. You were talking about how they have to establish it in the beginning, and maybe not the first scene, but the second scene is Hanukkah, and they make a big deal of it. And they definitely do that, what you're saying, which is just throw it out there at front so that it's a Jewish film.
Right.
But for the rest of the story, I was trying to trace, is the Jewishness just the context of his life and it's part of his family life and we're going to have it as part of the world, but is that part of his journey? Does the movie actually play with that? And I think in some cases, yes. And I think that's what we're going to be doing here over the next hour or so and talking about that and trying to mind where that happens. But I don't know, I think with more time, the movie might have gone deeper into his Jewish roots. And I think where it bleeds in, maybe it's a little more subtle than it would have been. So I think that's a really interesting comparison between what a TV show could do.
Well, I have my kippah counter over here and my rabbi counter. So as we're discussing the film and the plot and things like that, I'll keep track of how many times that kind of stuff shows up in the film. But why do you say we get into it? Let's get a little bit more context about the film itself, right? So as we said, it's directed by Steven Spielberg. It's co-written by Tony Kushner and Steven Spielberg. We got a lot of heavy hitters in terms of, the music is by John Williams. Cinematography is by Janusz Kaminski, who he's worked with before on a number of things. I think most recently West Side Story.
Yeah, they're all hacks.
Yeah.
Just a bunch of hacks. Yeah. First timers out of the gate.
Right.
Getting lucky. Right.
It's unbelievable, but and then, with the cast, we have Gabriel LaBelle as Sammy Fabelman, Paul Dano as his dad, Bert, Michelle Williams as Mitzi, Seth Rogen as Bobby, Uncle Bobby, and then Judd Hirsch as Uncle Boris, as we talked about. So, I think what I had heard was, or what I had read about was that the film, I forget, on a previous film, they had like discussed Steven Spielberg and Tony Kushner. I think they worked on Lincoln together, and they discussed the idea of this film of wanting to do like a personal film. And I think, at some point they had started writing some drafts and things like that and went back and forth. So it's been on his mind for a while to make this sort of intensely personal film. And I think now was the time to do it. At this point, both of his parents had passed away. So I know that I wasn't sure if that was like a conscious choice to kind of like wait till they're gone to kind of tell their story. But I think before we had mentioned on the Duck Soup episode that his mother owned a restaurant in Los Angeles called the Milky Way. And she was a regular fixture there, kind of playing host to a number of patrons, including myself at some point when I was a little kid. My grandparents used to take me there, and she would always like come over to our table and say hello. So seeing this movie and seeing that portrayal of her was kind of interesting. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I live in LA. That's where you're finding me right now.
Yeah.
And just down the block from the Milky Way.
Oh, nice.
And I've been there. I was there a couple of times before she died, before Leah Adler died. And it was fun. It was just like the food was fine. It wasn't like really anything fabulous, but you look in, you go inside, and there's like posters of Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. everywhere. And then she used to really hold court in that restaurant. Like she would go table to table and make sure your food was okay. And, so she was really super sweet and very involved in the community. So, they just did a revamp of the restaurant, and I haven't been there yet, but now it's like super expensive. And of course, she's not there. So I don't know if I'll go back, but yeah, it's definitely been a fixture in LA.
It's funny. I saw there was a recent piece of film criticism going around this past week over Twitter that I was reading, where someone was talking about how they were criticizing this movie, The Fabelmans, and talking about how the parents, Michelle Williams and Paul Dano, were miscast, was the criticism that they levied to the film. And I think people were just like, you're saying Steven Spielberg miscasts his own parents, who he knows better than anyone? Like, is that really like you? And the critic pretty likely didn't know the parents at all and couldn't necessarily have spoken to, whether or not they were miscast. But it sounds like the two of you met Steven Spielberg's mother. So I guess, I don't know if you want to weigh in on the question and maybe, add to the discourse, but did you think it was a good performance? Did she match up to the energy? I mean, I know she's, she was obviously presumably much older when you met her than she was in the film, but what do you think about that?
I mean, like the hairstyle was pretty spot on. Like that sort of, I don't even know if it was like a bob or a pixie cut. Like that hair was like pretty accurate. And like I remember she used to wear like overalls quite a bit, like denim overalls. So it was kind of accurate in that, regard.
That feels in spirit. Yeah,
I mean, she was definitely a character and unique. And I feel like Michelle Williams did a good job. Now, I guess my follow-up question to you, Harry, is were they miscast because they weren't Jewish? Was that the complaint, or just that they felt like it wasn't a good?
I think it was just a criticism of the acting.
Interesting.
Energy. Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
really?
I thought they were terrific in the film. We could get into the Jewish piece later, but like, I thought they did a pretty good job. Paul Dano does a good sort of like vanilla kind of guy, like to kind of counterbalance her performance. I thought they were great performances.
Well, I think that some of the reviews of the film, or maybe it was the interview with Spielberg himself in the New York Times, he talked about how he cast those two actors not necessarily because they looked like his parents, but because he saw performances of theirs where he saw his parents in those performances.
Oh, okay. Nice.
So, Michelle Williams has a very large body of work. And one of the performances that he saw her in was that series on TV, which was
Dawson's
about
Creek?
Fosse.
Oh,
which was
I got
about,
really excited. I was like,
I know.
what?
I know. Well, I'm sure he's seen some of that too. He's got kids who I'm sure have watched Dawson and Joey and Casey and all those kids. But no, Paul Dano, I don't remember exactly which portrayal he said reminded him of his dad. But what you were saying about Paul Dano is he does like kind of like a battered everyman, but with an capacity for either an emotional breakdown or a violent streak that he's suppressing. And in this case, I think it was like the wounded warrior of the former military man who had been who had seen, people die and all of that. So and that, of course, the World War II fascination or fixation is also a very big influence for Spielberg.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good read. I hadn't picked. I totally. Yeah, he did say it. Sammy said in the movie at some point, this I wanted to portray your war, and I totally had escaped me. I was like, oh yeah, of course, he's like a World War II vet. Anyway, this is all like fascinating context to get into the film. What do you say, Harry? Do you think it's time we check out the IMDb summary and let everyone know what we're talking about?
Sure. So, growing up in post-World War II era Arizona, young Sammy Fabelman aspires to become a filmmaker as he reaches adolescence, but soon discovers a shattering family secret and explores how the power of films can help him see the truth.
I like that.
You know what I like about it? It's obviously most people going into this movie know the context, but not necessarily that it's the Spielberg story. And I was talking to someone who had seen the movie before me, and he was just like, yeah, I was expecting it to be very Spielberg, but it really was just a coming of age story. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's what the movie is. This does, like, the movie particularly ends, not even at the beginning of his career, before the actual film career goes off. Like, this story is just about young Sammy Fabelman, and I loved it for that.
I don't know if this tramples on your outline at all. But I think one of the things that I really wished I could do is go into this movie not knowing that it was Steven Spielberg's story.
Okay.
Because I felt like it in some ways took me out of the film and kind of made me like look for those Easter eggs or those points where I'm like, oh, that became E.T. or that became Close Encounters, or, oh, was there a shark here? So I was just kind of thinking about all of those things. And I think it's a complicated space because it's not a straight biopic, Ray, the Ray Charles story, Walk the Line. It's a biographical drama with characters who are avatars of Spielberg's family. So they don't have to match exactly. But the truth of this kid coming of age and finding his craft, really, and his mode of expression, his emotional expression, his understanding of the world through that kind of camera lens, I think that's a great story on its own. It doesn't necessarily have to be Steven Spielberg's story. But, we know that it is. So we go into it with that. Right. And we say, oh, what a brilliant young kid this was. This is great. And then you're like, but it's Steven Spielberg. Of course he was brilliant. But then it's just like, it's about the parents and how they either encourage or discourage his developing this clear gift for seeing the world through the camera. So, I did enjoy that element of it. But there were a couple of times where I just wished I wasn't asking myself, did this really happen? Did this really happen? All that kind of stuff.
I wanted to jump back to your point, Harry, because I feel like I wish that movie actually didn't end where it ended. I wish we got kind of less family drama up top and maybe extend out 20 minutes past that last shot. So we see him going into making Jaws. That to me was honestly where the film kind of came alive, whereas that sort of end part where he's a fully developed, post chatting with David Lynch as John Ford. Esther, to your point, I feel like the fact that I do know it's Steven Spielberg, I'm kind of grading the film on a curve somewhat. I'm already oh, this is a Spielberg film, so I have to like it. But I was saying, I honestly felt, this doesn't weigh into my grade of the film itself as a Jewish film, but parts of the film I was just not so thrilled with. I just felt they were a little what's the word I'm looking for, indulgent, and it just felt kind of long in parts. It kind of dragged a little bit, and I could see Harry's got steam coming out of his ears, but it's true, man. That's just how I felt. I feel because it's Steven Spielberg, we have to give it a little bit more credit than if someone else told the same story. So anyway, just to speak to both of your points, but go ahead, Harry.
Yeah, you anticipated it a little bit, but I think I'm with Esther on this one, that I think the movie works so well not in spite of Steven Spielberg. I mean, he directed it fantastically, but I felt myself walking out of the theater, and this is like what you were saying, Esther, about, wanting to know what happened. And normally you walk out of a movie like that, like a Ray or a biopic or a movie like that. And the first thing, I tend to do is look up what actually happened, especially in the most magical moments of this movie, when it's like, there's no way it was that perfect that he connected it. Right. Then I'm thinking of scenes where, he's showing his mother, the film, and we'll talk about that in context when we run through the plot. And I was just thinking, like, did this all go exactly like this? Was this kid so emotionally intelligent? How does he tell the story? And I didn't want to know the answer. I don't want to know the details.
Right.
That John Ford meeting, like, that was just, I was thinking the whole time of that famous phrase, about sort of newspapers, like, when there's truth versus legend, print the legend kind of thing, just like mythologize the story. And I think that's what he's doing, Steven Spielberg. He's putting it through this frame of the Fabelmans because he's just telling the myth of his story. And I'm sure there's a lot of truth in terms of what motivated him to be who he was, what he saw in his parents, how he got, to where he obviously would become. But that story was framed the best way that he could in a very compelling, emotional, heartfelt movie. It was
mythological way.
And in the middle part, it literally becomes like a teenage comedy, like high school, comedy, like 80s comedy kind of movie that just like, it was just, he was telling his story through movies. And I think it worked the best like that. I didn't need to get any more obvious Spielberg or any of those references. I didn't need to see the dinosaur toy he had as a kid.
Yeah, sure. I get you. Totally makes sense. What do you say? With all this in mind, what do you think we take a quick break and we come right back and then we jump into our plot? Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
All right.
I'm here for that.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Jews on Film. We are here with Esther Kustanowitz talking about the film The Fabelmans. Harry, do you want to get us kicked off with the plot of the film?
The movie opens and a young Sammy Fabelman goes with his parents to see Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth. And he's both mesmerized and scared by the movie, but specifically the train crash sequence in it. So for Hanukkah, he asks his parents for a model train set. And we have this great montage where he gets a new train each night and ultimately has a full train car. And he assembles this toy. So his mother, Mitzi, who's played by Michelle Williams, as we mentioned, recognizes that what Sammy really wants is control over what he's afraid of. He's been kept up by nightmares of this train sequence, and she encourages him to recreate the film and recreate the crash sequence with his model train. She gives him a camera and has him film it. He does so. He falls in love with filmmaking. And through this opening montage, we kind of witness him falling in love with movies and creating a lot of home videos with and for his family.
Yeah, I mean, I love this sort of montage of like, we go from like very primitive kind of train accidents, recreating that scene from The Greatest Show on Earth, to then like graduating to like mummy movies where they use the toilet paper and then they're using like ketchup and whatever to like recreate like a dentist scene. I thought it was really cute. And I think this is one thing, I don't know if it's a Jewish thing or not, but just like his sort of progression as like a filmmaker, going from like the very most basic camera and the most basic film that he's creating to then sort of the end of the film where he's doing like slow motion shots and he's cutting shots together and really telling a story with like nice titles and everything. And it was kind of cool as an editor to kind of see the progression from something so basic to something that is, evoking emotion and even making the jocks cry. So any thoughts on this first part, Esther?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think it's really valuable to hear your perspective as a film editor, because, obviously I work from like story and character, and you work from like, you can appreciate the technical wizardry and mastery in a different way than I can, for sure. And I don't know about you, Harry. I don't know much about, but I know that you're already offended by this hot take, and we'll see if we can offend you a little bit more before we're done, because that's part of the Talmud of like discussion of films, is that we can all encounter the same text and come away with kind of different perspectives. So I'll say that, like, since we're going chronologically, I'll address, kind of the early Jewy moment in the film, which is the approach to the house, and, which one is ours? It's the one without any lights, right? So in, having seen this, and it's the only dark house on the street. And for Hanukkah, what he wants is Christmas light. I did a little bit of research because I remembered a story and I was trying to find it, and I found it in a book called Stars of David, which is a 2005, I think, or 6 book by Abigail Pogrebin. She's a writer, wrote for the New York Times for many, many years. And she interviewed a lot of celebrities who were Jewish about their Jewish identities. And I'm just going to read this because I found the story and I think you'll find it familiar. So it says that he likes Christmas and he likes Hanukkah and Christmas, and that they do both in his home. And he called Christmas the one holiday I wished I could have partaken in every year I was growing up. And then she says, his longing was especially acute as an 8-year-old in Haddon Heights, New Jersey. I would go to my dad and say, Dad, can't we put lights up? We're the only house on the block that doesn't have lights. And my dad would say, we have a porch light. I said, Dad, you know what I mean. Our neighbors used to win these awards for decoration, yada, yada. Our neighborhood was like a light show, and we were the black hole of Calcutta. But my dad would never allow us to do anything. One time he said, if you want to, we can put the menorah in the window. And I said, no, then people will think we're Jews. So, I think the relationship with Judaism is, at least for this young Sammy Fabelman, and it sounds like also for young Steven Spielberg, that Judaism was a liability. It marked you as different and not in a good way. And, all of that is really, kind of one of the ways that Judaism is often portrayed on screen, is like not necessarily as a value system, but as a way of marking difference and outsiderness, and like literal darkness in a sea of lighted homes. Just the visual of that, I'm sure, also appealed to the young Spielberg as a very resonant image. He has an eye for these things. And I did like the marking of time, the passage of time marked by Hanukkah candles. I thought that was really a fun little thing, right? Because it also was much more joyful than, approaching the darkened house. And so I really did like that. And I just feel like, the Judaism thing is something that we've traced throughout the film, mostly in, I guess, in New Jersey, and then they moved to Arizona, and then it's Northern California, right? So that's the same Spielberg route as well. And in those places, the Judaism is different as well. So I think that's what I want to say for now.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of great points. I mean, I'll start with the first one you made, which was about me being upset by the whole editor creative read. But that's the movie, right? It's the relationship with Sammy's father and his mother. It's taking the creativity, marrying it with the
artists
with
and
the technical proficiency.
Right?
Exactly. So I love that. Let's keep that energy up. But I really liked what you were talking about, our sort of introduction to his Jewishness, because, we were talking about this at the beginning, when we were comparing it to a TV show, just, how much is the Jewishness really going to drive the character, the growth, the depth? And I think you kind of isolated what I think is the biggest influence of his Jewishness on his life. And it's really that engendering that kind of isolation. And I think a big thread of this movie, and we'll talk about this in some later scenes, but is Sammy's emotional detachment from a lot of things, and the way that he always has to isolate himself in order to be the filmmaker. He's the person who's directing when everyone's acting on screen. He's the one standing in the back in the projection room while everyone's watching his movie.
Yes.
He's the student in high school that's, isolated for his Jewishness. So introducing that to us at the beginning, I think is really how the Jewishness is used, which I agree with you is not necessarily the most positive read, right? That's the association that I've definitely seen, especially in a lot of, it's the holiday season, and it's the Hanukkah Christmas time of year. And that's kind of the read you see in any Jewish story that takes place that's centered on this time, is that isolation. But what I did really like is that the movie, I think, introduces us to the Jewishness, both on that one front of this sort of recognizable to the audience. Look, they're the isolated community. They also do a little bit of healthy exposition in the car there, kind of explaining that, oh, you're not going to have Christmas, you're the Jew. But then what the film does, which I also really enjoyed, was once it's done kind of explaining to what we'll call the lay audience, what it means to be Hanukkah Jewish, gives a little bit of that. I think it starts to up its game a little bit. I think when you have that sequence, which you spoke about, which I loved, when they kind of edit us through the 8 nights of Hanukkah, you see them lighting another candle. He gets another train. They do a lot of shortcuts that if you're not so familiar with Hanukkah, with the brachas, with, how that all works, you might not have gotten immediately. And that was a little bit of just Steven Spielberg trusting his audience to say, I'm just going to give you an actual slice of the Jewish experience. Something, Daniel, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, but we always call out is when they say an actual bracha or say a Jewish prayer in a film, how accurate is it? And I thought they did a pretty good job. They didn't handhold, they didn't explain it, maybe translate it or just make it more accessible, so to speak. I think they just played it for how he must have experienced it. So I like the way that it navigated his Jewishness in those early sequences.
Yeah, I loved your read of sort of being that other, both like as a Jew, but then also as like the filmmaker. I was totally going to make that connection, and I'm glad that you did, of just like these solitary scenes of whether it's him editing in his room by himself or like sitting in the hallway locker area by himself, or just like completely detached from the film because at this point you've already seen it 100 times, so you hate it, and everyone's laughing and everyone's enjoying it, and you're just noticing the mistakes in the film. Like that is real.
Spoken like an editor.
I can relate to that. But yeah, I thought the beginning part was great with the lighting of the menorah and things like that. I did notice a little bit with Paul Dano. There was like a little learning curve there, but I'm not going to nitpick so early in the film summary. Yeah. I did want to see if we could move it on to the next beat, if that's all right, because it's a long movie. Sammy's father, Bert, who's played by Paul Dano, announces that he gets a new engineering job and that they're moving to Phoenix. But Mitzi pleads with him to find a job for Benny, who is Bert's best friend and coworker at, I believe he works at GE, and then he moves over to, I forget the other company, or maybe he eventually ends up at IBM.
It's IBM, yeah.
But it's like GE, but then there's some other first company. Name it escapes me now, but Seth Rogen is playing Uncle Benny, and that's
the important part.
Yeah, exactly. And so they move to Phoenix, and Sammy joins the Boy Scouts, and they attend the film The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is directed by John Ford, which will be important later in the film. So inspired by watching this film again, Sammy stages and films a Western starring some of his other Boy Scouts, and they premiere it in front of the rest of the troop, as well as Sammy's family, who's like all amazed. At this point, I think he's graduated, if we're doing a camera count. So at the beginning of the film, we have his dad's borrowed Brownie camera, which is like an 8mm camera. And I think he's moved up one level to like a next camera that his parents have purchased for him. And I think he rents an editing machine to make this happen. But, there's a lot of cool editing tricks that he picks up. I believe his mom is playing piano in this time, and she steps on a sheet music with her heel, and that inspires him to edit the film in such a way so that when the people are shooting, it's like shows like a flash of light, and that really like wows him, because after he's edited, or wows the audience, because after watching it, like I said, over and over again, he sees that it's sort of falling flat, and so he decides to add in this sort of little flourish. But so this is Sammy's first public display of the film, and everyone's on board with it and really excited to see it.
One of the things I really like is that he seems to really thrive in Phoenix. Like, as embarrassed as he was of being Jewish in New Jersey, which is strange because I'm from New Jersey. So a lot of Jews in New Jersey. I mean, yeah. But in Phoenix, he seems to really have found his own with this Boy Scout troop. People follow him. They do whatever he wants them to. He casts them things. They follow along. They take direction. And he's really like a leader. At the same time, he's doing it all. He's very single-minded, and like,
yes,
it's one of the things that you were talking about before. About how he just does it like kind of removed and behind the camera. It reminded me of Mark Cohen, the character in Rent, who is also accused by his friends of like burying himself in his work and only seeing things through the camera lens because he doesn't know how to engage with life in a real way, only through the lens. And so I think that's also something that occurred to me when I was watching this performance of the young Sammy Fabelman.
Totally.
And Yeah. And this is something I noted on the podcast with Aaron when we talked about our excitement that this movie was coming. We didn't do a deep dive, but Fabelman, I feel like, is also like a almost parallel name to Spielberg, because a fable and a spiel sounds like they might be connected.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Right.
Manberg, it's all part of the Jewish suffix game. So, that was just something that I always saw. I was like, oh, it's called the Fabelmans, is it? Okay. Is it called the Storybergs next? Is it called?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I did love that. I also really like Gabriel LaBelle's performance. He played the adolescent Spielberg. Are we there yet?
Yeah.
Or yes, we are.
Mm-hmm.
He also played the young John Bernthal character in American Gigolo, which I don't know if anybody saw, but he's a very likable young actor, and I really liked his performance in this movie.
Yeah, I think he's definitely got that sort of cult of personality very early, and that's really what being the director is. It's taking that. We saw him as the sort of isolated figure within his family to, whatever success that brought him in the home movie era. But now as we've graduated to, he's really putting on, they're these short silent films, so it's not anything too large scale yet, but he's in this position now where he's got to kind of be in charge, and he has to be behind the camera. He's directing his friends. He's clearly, he's leading them. We have that great sequence where they're going to see the movie and they're all on bicycles together. And I don't remember if he's in the front, but you kind of get the idea that he's the one who dragged them to see this movie. And first of all, you get this great. I know we said we weren't going to poke at the movie and see the inspirations, but you're thinking E.T. You see all these kids. Yeah. Exactly. You see all of them on their bikes together. But I think this begins everything that we're saying about the detachment that he now feels. Like one of the threads also in that moment, we see him kind of bike past, there's a girl in their grade, I think, and all his friends are kind of joking with him, teasing with him that he doesn't talk to her and that he tried to talk to her. And it's almost like what you were saying about him being the director. All he can see is kind of what's wrong with the shot, right? She has this sort of booger in her nose. That's how they joke with it. But you get the sense he's not making that emotional connection because he's thinking differently. He's thinking art. He's thinking creatively. He creates these movies. I think we learned that he starts making a lot of shorts without any women in them. So I think we're picking up on a lot of the threads that kind of come to a head at later scenes are already happening in this early sequence.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think it would be interesting if we all made movies of what we remember our lives to have been during adolescence, and wonder if it would bear any resemblance to a documentary made of us during that time, because it's always, the personal lens on your own experience it can be a really harsh one. And what a objective camera sees may not be what you see. And, that's why it's always, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but every once in a while where somebody takes a picture of you and you're like, that's not me. And sometimes it's like, that's not me, because is that really what I look like? I should really stay inside forever. And sometimes it's like, wow, I didn't know I could look like that. Or that's a really interesting emotion that was captured. And that's somebody who's behind the camera. That's not something I can do with a selfie, because there's a layer of self-consciousness.
There's like a flash, like when his parents are getting divorced, like towards the end of the film, and he sees them in the mirror and he imagines that he's like filming them getting divorced, which is just like, he's sort of seeing everything, like you said, through this camera lens, and sort of seeing how cinematic it would be if I like filmed my parents. And even on the camping trip, which we'll get to in a second, like, he's filming that and he's not really like experiencing it as much. There's very few scenes, maybe like the swimming scene and like a little bit of the Kumbaya singing by the fire, that he's actually like sort of engaged in what's going on.
And they make the point early on with that first, kind of obsession with the train, that what he's really trying to do is control the things that frighten him. So seeing that train like get hit the car get hit by a train on a train track in a movie was just like it really rattled him. Right. And the question of how could he control that feeling is if he could understand how it was achieved visually. And so I think that that's the lens that we're meant to understand he takes in terms of interpreting these things that are really just too big to deal with, whether it's bullying or, war, or which is, I guess, bullying is a kind of war, but or girls, like, just not knowing how to talk to young women. So I think that, and certainly once his parents start having trouble kind of trying to capture parts of trying to capture the relationship so that maybe he can save it, but also just so that he can feel some sort of control over what he's seeing and experiencing.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, talking about actually trying to save it and whether he wants to affect change. Because when I was thinking about that early scene with the train and kind of when he refilms the crashing sequence, in some ways, I expected he wanted to get the train so that he could film a sequence where the train doesn't crash, where the car drives out of the way and maybe things are all okay. But that's not what he's trying to do with his movies. He's not trying to play, magic imagery trick and rewrite the narrative. It's almost the way that he can process. It's, controlling for him is just about processing what's happening. And when, like you were mentioning, Daniel, and I was excited to talk about that scene when we get up to it, so we'll cheat now and then go back to it. But when he imagines himself filming his parents telling them about the divorce, he's not stepping in. He's not thinking, how can we change this? What could have been done? But it's just, let me process this with my camera and then maybe later get to it. And I think that's his relationship with the young girls we were talking about, where at this point in his young life, he's not processing. He's almost gathering information. And, we'll see what happens obviously later with his relationships, but it's very observant. It's very much based in reaction, right? And reaction shots become a huge plot point in the film later on. Right.
You film first and then you edit and then you create the story. You have to process it all. Do you want to talk about the camping scenes, Harry?
Following this whole Boy Scout scene where he shows the film, we follow the Fabelmans as they go on a camping trip. So first we see in the car on the way there, Bert and Sammy have an important conversation about Bert becoming a little bit more critical of all the money that Sammy is spending on what he calls an expensive hobby that's not going to produce anything real. But at the same time, they try to connect over what Sammy is trying to do, but it still sets the stage for a little bit of their strife later on. But once they actually arrive at the campsite, we see the Fabelmans. They're having fun. They're going on these big swings and having a great old time on this camping site. And one scene I want to call out is they sit down by the campfire. And I wanted your help, the two of you, if you recognize the song or I called it almost like Grauman-esque. And I want to say Yiddish. I don't want to tell. It might be another language.
Russian.
Could it be Russian?
It didn't sound Yiddish to me.
All right, so maybe that was my Jewish lens working a little too hard.
Because I feel like Seth Rogen was making fun of some of the jokes around the, he was improvising a little bit and doing Russian references in it. So that was my assumption. I could be wrong though.
I'm a little unclear as to the background of this family, because there was moments where I think the mother was speaking to her mother-in-law in possibly Hungarian.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. I don't speak Hungarian. I don't speak Yiddish, but I know what Yiddish sounds like. And that didn't sound like Yiddish to me. So the question, is it Czech? Is it Russian? Is it Hungarian? It's something like that. It's, kind of like Eastern European language, or it's something that is a gibberish that's supposed to sound like Eastern European language, but I can't imagine Steven Spielberg would do a gibberish. He would probably go for authenticity. So I'm sure it was an actual language, but it wasn't one that I recognized. And so therefore I don't actually remember the song that they were using by the campfire. So, and, I think that also, since it's just in theaters in the last, couple of weeks. So if we were doing this in a year, we would have an opportunity to watch it again or to rewind, but we didn't have that opportunity. So this is all based on or at least for me, it's all based on a single viewing of it. And I didn't take any notes. So,
yeah.
It is coming out. It is coming out on the 13th of December on streaming. So it'll be after this recording. But if anyone wants to pause our podcast, go watch the movie and come back and listen to this, I think that'd be great. Sorry, Harry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I agree. I'm sure there's already, if not yet, there will be a transcription of exactly what was being said in what language. But it was just a very charming scene. And the biggest takeaway, other than I think the Eastern European roots or wherever that comes from, that language, was also that Benny is bonding with the children, bonding with the family very well at this campsite. So that night, after they have this whole campfire, there's this important scene where Mitzi kind of enters this, I don't know what to call that sort of state of mind, just very whimsical, very spiritual almost, and just starts dancing around. You know, if you've seen the movie, you know, obviously, but sort of like flailing her arms a little bit, dancing very slowly. And her and Benny is very encouraging. He tells Sammy, he says, get this shot. And Sammy says, I don't think there's enough light. So then they turn the car lights on and she kind of dances slowly there. And there's this moment where Sammy's younger sister is pleading with her mom to stop because between the car headlights and the nightgown she's wearing, her outfit has become a little bit see-through. But Benny, on the other end, is trying to push her away and very much encouraging this. And we get a little cut to Bert on the side while he sits silently. And it upsets the dynamic a little bit. It starts to shift, I think, the perfect kind of the perfect family that we've seen up until this point, and kind of sets things off a little bit. So that's kind of that big that camping scene that anchors the center of the film.
I love how Bert is like trying to explain to the kids about the wonders of the engineering of how the sticks all fit together and they make this perfect campfire, and no one is interested in the least bit. They all just want to go play and, you know, go play with mom and Benny, who's like the fun uncle. But yeah, definitely fun to sort of see Sammy and the gang outside of their normal surroundings, kind of doing something in the great outdoors.
I will say that, you know, and this maybe speaks to Michelle Williams's performance a little bit. And I don't know if we're dissecting the performances just yet, but
let's do it.
It's, you know, I feel like her performance was a little bit over the top, and I know that this character is supposed to be very much like kind of larger than life and like ethereal, and you know, I use the words whimsical. I would say a kind of slightly unstable. I would say an artist. I would say felt kind of trapped in her own life and only at various points experienced moments of release and freedom. And I think that the fire scene is one of those where she kind of feels very artistic. She feels attractive. She feels kind of like an object in a way that she finds empowering, or she feels free. And you know, even what you said is like what she's wearing is it's very diaphanous, and like you can really see right through it. And you know, her approach is like she doesn't care. She's just used to the word flailing, but like, you know, I would say more like really feeling her body and expressing it in her limbs, and just kind of like, people who are listening can't see that I'm doing something that looks like swimming actually, but she did it better. But I think that, you know, her performance is really so I think well, you were saying before, you said Bob, I think it's a page boy. I think that's the name of the hairstyle.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just like she's very given to shifts of mood in a way that, you know, she ends up like going to a psychologist at some point. But like, she really does need some assistance. And I don't think she gets it in her house. And so being out in nature was a freeing thing for her. But it also, like, as you said, is a point of kind of, it's like they went on vacation as a family and they return maybe less so. And so it's an important kind of moment. But, you know, I don't know. I whenever I watch a movie, I wonder, who am I in this movie? Right. And I don't know if this is a game other people play, but for me, it's never the main character. It's always some weird side character. So for me, it was his sister who was like trying to get her to stop dancing because, you know, she was, so like, that's kind of like the the sister was like, come on, just do the normal thing, or we can see through your dress. Like it's embarrassing. Come on. And so that's kind of like, I think that the character, I think that the Sammy Fabelman character is probably more in line with what his sister thinks than what his than what Uncle Benny thinks he should do. He seems like a very reluctant filmmaker in that moment, and I think he senses that something's not right about it. Although he, is still too young and hasn't really seen what that something wrong is yet.
But he will. Yeah, I really agree with that. I think that scene and that performance specifically, I've been thinking about it a lot because, like you said, it's very big. It's very outsized. It's bordering on, I don't want to call it overacting. I think it's just acting very large. And I've been trying to figure out, as someone who generally prefers subtlety, what to make of that. And I think it fits into both the balance we were talking about of that, the sort of contrast that Bert and Mitzi represent. Versus, the sort of very clinical engineering, very thoughtful versus like really this representation of just art almost unleashed, right? This like unbridled, just creative expression. And I think it's a combination of that paired with what we said earlier about this film really is, it's Steven Spielberg, right? It's Sammy Fabelman, really Steven Spielberg, but mythologizing his story. And this is how he remembers his mother. So it's not in the particulars of what might have been maybe a more grounded, more realistic expression. She was this artistic force in my life that I think everything you were saying is correct, Esther, that she's kind of bound and feels very like she doesn't have room to express herself. She needs to be outdoors in nature to kind of have that moment of being unleashed. And that's something that I think Benny, more so than Bert, recognizes and embraces about her. And spoiling a little bit later when we ultimately get to the divorce, which is not quite a spoiler because we've mentioned it a bunch of times already. But I think Bert recognizes that he was too different from her. He couldn't offer her that. And when she decides she needs to go back to Phoenix, it's because everything we were saying, she is this artistic force that needs to be egged on by someone who's encouraging, who says, no, keep dancing, get the lights on you, have your moment. And I think that's just born out of how Sammy or how Steven Spielberg really remembers, who his mom was and who she was as an influence on who he would become.
Right. Correct me if I'm wrong. Does her dancing scene not come like when they're discussing potentially moving and then, or does them discussing like, does Benny and Bert discussing their move to Arizona, I believe, or to California? Are they not discussing this like by the fire and she's in the tent and then she comes out and dances, or that happens kind of after the dance? If it comes afterward,
don't remember.
Okay, don't worry about it. I was trying to make a point and drawing on the fact that like she often does stuff to be the center of attention, and I wondered if this was sort of like a decoy, or not a decoy, but like a distraction where they're like talking talkless about like moving and making this next big change in their life, and she's like, "Hey, look at me, I'm dancing. Let's pay attention to me. I'm the artist here." I wondered if that could be a possible read on it.
I think you're onto something in terms of the timing of all of this. It's not just that she's outside of nature. I mean, we learn later on, because Sammy captures a lot of this when he's filming the trip, because we didn't mention this, but he's been filming most of what's happening on the trip. But we learn later on that it seems like her relationship with Benny kind of comes to a head on this trip. We see in the later footage, they start stealing glances, holding hands. He puts his arm around her at some point. So I think all of that energy is coming to a head and all of the anxiety around that major change. So If this is her way of kind of releasing, I think, that inner conflict, that inner turmoil she's feeling, where she's torn between this and doesn't want to disrupt the family. I mean, that's definitely the read I get of her later on, that she never wants to disrupt this idyllic family unit we've seen in the first half of the film. It's just almost overwhelming. So I think it's more of her response to that major change, but in some ways that's definitely tied to the move to California. And when that does happen, I think that's what really pushes her to the breaking point later on.
Yeah, I have an English major observation to make that's kind of based on something Harry said. So I remember when I was like in 10th grade and they taught us about Shakespeare, that one of the things that they taught us about was symbolic geography. So for instance, Where it's Egypt is a place of magic, Rome is a place of logic, right? So the forest is a place where everything, crazy can happen. And I think that the symbolic geography of Mitzi being a force of nature and being really attracted to nature's forces. We see that with the fire sequence. We also see that when she decides to chase into like a hurricane or a tornado, like she sees a tornado coming and she takes the kids and puts them in a car and drives right toward it and then realizes that it's actually dangerous and then turns back. But I think that kind of play that she does with trying to conquer or either to be one with nature or to conquer it, but I feel, or to be swept away by it. But I think she does have this kind of energy that's attracted to things elementally. You've got the wind and the fire, what else, we could make the, earth and whatever, the air. Right. So I don't know. Are there elements?
Water.
There are 4 elements in there somewhere. But anyway, the point of I think the idea of nature as something that both traps Mitzi and makes her feel free and connected to the universe. I think that there is definitely something there to be played with and overanalyzed.
Esther, I love what you said about that, Mitzi being like this force of nature, a bit of a stretch here, but, she is kind of intense when it comes to Sammy's swim lessons. And I think she gets super mad at him. And so she hits him. So maybe we could stretch that and say that it's like somewhat related to water in that, other element. I don't know if it really works that way or not, but hey, this is Jews on Film and we always stretch things quite a bit.
I do think that the fire and the wildness and the uncontrollability of elements, I think is really very, very much characterizes Mitzi.
Totally. And she loves it so much, spoiler alert, that she ends up back in Phoenix. I mean, it has such a strong place in her heart that's where, in addition to having Benny be there, she just kind of needs to be in Arizona,
And then we didn't even point this out, but I think Bert, as we've been saying, kind of represents the opposite, but he's really characterized not by nature, but by technology, computer, right? The exact opposite. But even the way that especially computing existed at that time is sort of very fixed structure, very analytical, very numbers based, the way they talk about there's that great scene in the beginning where they talk about how, Benny is kind of like hyping up Bert and he's like, oh, he figured out how to get these machines that normally have to reset the things to kind of, work and loop together, but it's all very focused in together. It's all very tightly controlled. And it really is the opposite.
After this awesome, life-changing for many people's camping trip, Mitzi's mother unfortunately passes away. She's kind of overcome with grief. Bert reaches out to Sammy and he pleads to him to make a home video from the camping trip in order to cheer her up. Sammy realizes that this is sort of at the same time as when he's planning to shoot his World War II epic film, his next one. So he's kind of wrestling with that. But all the while, Uncle Boris, played by Judd Hirsch, shows up and sort of amazes Sammy and the family with the stories of the circus. He was a lion tamer in the circus, and then he kind of made his way into Hollywood, into the pictures, and he kind of explains to Sammy, all sorts of things. He passes on so much knowledge. But right before bed, Boris lectures Sammy on the sacrifices an artist needs to make and the costs to the family. He says something like, art and family will tear you apart. I loved it. Sammy works on the home video after talking with Boris and thinking about things for quite a bit. And he notices, as he's kind of like going through the film slowly but surely, back and forth, he notices his mother and Benny kind of exchanging glances, holding hands, and even stealing a kiss, I think. So he grows kind of like cold towards Mitzi, ignoring her and Benny after the screening of his World War II epic film. After weeks of fighting, like I was saying before, Mitzi accidentally slaps Sammy on the back and kind of leaves a handprint. And he says, all right, come with me. I'm going to show you this footage. So he, in a sort of like visual homage or a visual reference to his initial screening in the closet, he puts her in this closet and she screens it by herself. And they sort of cry and he promises not to tell anyone, but they have this kind of like intense moment. But we'll pause here and kind of collect some thoughts on these very heavy and very meaningful scenes.
Right. It's like, it's kind of like a blooper reel that isn't funny. It's like just a super cut of the most awkward moments that her son witnessed between her and Uncle Benny.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. And also just to tag onto our discussion from just, a few minutes ago about the wild elements of Mitzi, not Misty, I can't say it, Mitzi, is that she also enjoys this enclosed space with her son. This is a space where she first like saw his talent and first really saw the window of film as his way of looking at the world. And that closet is a very small, enclosed, intimate space that she's in with him. And I think it's an important emotional closet. I don't know, but it maybe, because, that's where she first learned that he was going to be, that he was super talented. And here's where she sees that he's seen something that no one else saw. And those are two kind of facets of the same diamond, is that, it's like he sees a lot and he's talented, but that means that because he's talented, he sees a lot.
Right.
So,
right.
So, and I think that closed environment is very different than the wild outdoors, which she feels called to, the big openness of Arizona as symbolic geography, to tag back to English major corner, as we say. I think that's all. It's all interesting. And honestly, none of this is in my notes that I prepared. Like, this is all just coming back to me when we're talking about it. So,
that's awesome.
So yeah, it's really fascinating to be able to do that with you two, just to see how much I actually do remember through my own, these two camera lenses here that live in the front of my face.
Very cool.
I think that's what this movie's all about. I think that's the power of seeing your life, connecting to your emotions from this other perspective, from looking through the camera. I mean, that's exactly how Sammy is getting to revisit and reframe and recontextualize, things that he might not have picked up. Maybe he did notice, maybe wasn't so clear to him on that trip. And that's exactly what we're doing. I wanted to point out, I think the two scenes you were talking about, Daniel, first of all, Uncle Boris showing up in that pivotal conversation. And to me, that was the most interesting part of the movie, or really when it changed gears, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about of the sort of opposing forces we've been talking about of, nature and art versus science and structure was everything that's already been famously part of the Steven Spielberg mythos, so to speak. And that's kind of stuff that I expected to see, that I knew was going to be there. But when Uncle Boris explains this very shocking, I think, revelation that if you're going to pursue art, right, if you're going to go all in on art, it requires sacrifice to family. It's something that feels so out of place in the Steven Spielberg biopic, so to speak, because he's someone who is so successful at telling stories about nuclear families and about bringing, has such an emotional core to a lot of his movies. And I think in the context of the movie, it inspires the scene that comes after it, because Uncle Boris tells him you have to choose between art or family. And only then does he say, okay, I'll put together this family movie for my mother because I'm going to go down the family route. Like I can delay my artistic thing. Family is more important to me. And what happens when he decides, okay, I'm going to go down the family route? He uncovers the surprise that ultimately leads to the unraveling of his family. It's as much as he's trying to pursue his camera career with, and maintain family in there. I think for all the reasons we've discussed earlier in the episode about the way that, thinking as a director creates this emotional detachment and just, how that changes the way you see the world. But ultimately, the movie, I think, proposes that it's not so possible. It's not so feasible to embrace both. And, we'll talk about this later, but when Sammy eventually does put down the camera and stops filming, I think it's because he recognizes what Uncle Boris said to be true. And he's trying his hardest to commit fully to family. But, we know Steven Spielberg, the artist, just can't get away with that.
Yeah. I mean, I relate to this sort of art versus family conundrum all the time. I feel like, yeah, let's a very special episode of Jews on Film. But I feel like, it's difficult, you know, like trying to say like, all right, I'm going to like do a 48-hour film festival and I'm going to like, you know, spend 2 dinner times and bedtimes and away from the family and to just go make a horror movie with my friends. And it's like, it's I related to that struggle a lot. I feel like Uncle Boris has like so many pearls of wisdom and he just like drops all these truth bombs on Sammy. And it just kind of, for me, it kind of came out of left field, but it was so enjoyable to have this sort of like prophet type figure come in and deliver the goods from Judd Hirsch. And, you know, also the fact that he like tore his shirt and he was talking about mourning and introducing all this stuff. I just loved it all. And, you know, and the fact that he like talked about old Hollywood and he's gonna, you know, this is the first of many lessons that Sammy gets from people in Hollywood. And, you know, kind of Boris sort of downplays it. Like Sammy has this sort of like wonderment about making movies and films. And as we can see in the World War II film, he is getting better at it like that. I love that scene of him like talking to the GI actor who's like this jock, and he's like really getting him so worked up that the jock character is like crying and just like totally getting lost in the scene. So Sammy's leveling up as he's accumulating all this knowledge and all this good stuff.
I just also want to, you know, I'm happy you mentioned around Uncle Boris, the moments of Shiva. He tears Kriya and he makes a big deal of it. And like I enjoyed in the beginning of the film, doesn't really take the time to, you know, exposit about it, explain exactly what's going on. He just makes the point to Sammy. He says, Sammy's like, you could sleep in my bed if you want. I'll find a place to sleep. He's like, nope, I'm mourning. I'm in Shiva. I'm sleeping on the floor. And, you know, this is Jews on Film. We've been so lost, I think, and not lost, but we've been going down these, I think, incredible reads of just the actual emotional dynamics of the movie. But we can't forget Uncle Boris, who I really think is the most recognizably Jewish figure in the entire film, and that whole sequence. Sure. And just seeing him come with his, you know, old country accent and just bringing in, you know, there were a couple, you know, mashugas and lines like that I definitely remembered writing down. But he really brings in that energy and kind of showcases the lineage of Sammy Fabelman. He
comes in and he's like a medley of influences. Like he's got like this like old world kind of like, you know, new immigrant thing, but he also has the bootstrapping thing, but he also has the artist thing, and he also has the Jewish thing. So like all of those things really are an important exposure for Sammy. Mm-hmm. And I think that his, you know, that's where we often see on film or, you know, on the small screen is that a lost relative, an older relative comes back in and deposits some Judaism. And so I think that that's kind of what he did here. And, you know, Judd, I always have to stop to think if it's Hirsch or Nelson. Hirsch. Judd Hirsch is like you said, one of these really identifiably Jewish actors who plays Jewish characters very frequently. Wears yarmulkes occasionally too, and you know, I think he did what he was supposed to do in this role. I felt that the monologue was just, if we're going to be critical, I can't believe I'm criticizing Steven Spielberg, but like, I felt like for me, that monologue was too much and too over the top. And, you know, it's not really the most subtle of criticisms to say that a performance is over the top. But for me, it's like, am I getting lost in this character as he's portrayed, or am I saying, oh, this is a Judd Hirsch monologue, you know? And it seemed like a Judd Hirsch monologue, which is not a terrible thing to have, but it took me out of it, actually. Gotcha. And I think a lot of people are saying that he should get an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. And like, I'm sure he will, but like, you know, I don't know. I was mixed on it.
Yeah, the way you're describing how he just sort of shows up reminds me, we don't really know who he is. We haven't heard of this character before he comes. We kind of get that glimpse of him the night before because Mitzi is awoken in her dreams by, you know, a call from her dead mother, this kind of, you know, this nightmare she's obviously having where her mother tells her, don't let in this guest. And then the next morning we see Uncle Boris show up to the car, and then Mitzi kind of recognizes, and she exposits to the children and to the audience, of course. She says, "Oh, that's my uncle. That was my mother's brother. That must be the person he didn't want in."
Don't let him in.
Yeah, exactly. He chose art. He went in this other direction and abandoned our family. Like, he really comes in as this almost device. He shares all this wisdom with Sammy, really sends him on the emotional journey. And like I'm saying, this was, in my opinion, some of the most profound part of the film. So he really just becomes the voice of maybe these ideas that the film wanted to work in about the sacrifices of art and family, and then leaves the next morning and disappears for the rest of the film.
Right.
And I don't want to join your, I'm hesitant to join your train, Esther, of maybe being too critical of this one scene. But in some ways, he really is this almost like angelic figure. Let's call him an angel. Maybe we'll call this a positive Jewish reference, but this almost angelic figure shows up, gives over some important wisdom to Sammy that really will dictate his future decisions. We'll trace that throughout the rest of the film. And then he kind of disappears. I mean, it's somewhere between Deus Ex Machina and Angel.
That's what I was saying. It's like the Jew Ex Machina. Is that the crane deposited him into the scene so that he could be all Jewy and kind of bring it all together. And then he says, "Peace, I'm out." Right. And then we don't see him. So I think that there is definitely something to that.
I mean, it's like this, Sammy's on this journey to becoming a filmmaker. And like, I feel like in these like video games or whatever, you like meet in these RPGs or, the role-playing games or whatever, you like encounter a certain person and you get a certain weapon, and then you kind of level up and you're able to like tackle the next thing. And I feel like he gets his stuff from Boris, and then that enables him to make his World War II epic and to connect with the people and to be sort of inspired and to really, I thought the filmmaking scenes and seeing Sammy go from like train to cowboy movie to World War II movie and to just kind of leveling up to the Ditch Day film, like he just gets better every time. And all of it is kind of like informed about like from what we're seeing. And I love that about it. Yeah.
I think it's also true to the to whatever adolescent stage he's in. If you think about what kids generally, how they progress through their toys, from trains to westerns to war to kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure.
And then you go to, I hope that wasn't too plosive for the mic. And then moving forward into where I think we'll eventually get to is like his dealing with girls and the jocks and the bullying and all of those things that are a little bit more mature, even as they are also adolescent.
Exactly. That's such a perfect segue, Esther. Harry, do you want to get us on to let's get us to California, shall we? California, here we come.
So exactly. So this Arizona adventure ends when Bert announces that they're going to move to California. He's got yet another job. This time, unfortunately, he can't bring Benny along. So he's going to be going alone. They have this emotional goodbye. We get this great scene where Benny buys Sammy a camera. Like you were saying, Daniel levels up. He buys him this new camera as a parting gift. But Sammy reluctantly accepts it, I think, just between the ill will he might have for Benny right now and also the way that in some ways, I would say film has let him down a little bit because it exposed so much and disrupted his family. He's entering this phase where he's stepping away from filmmaking for a little bit. So we follow Sammy as he arrives at his new high school, and he's immediately bullied by a group of anti-Semitic jocks. They call him Bagelman. They hang a bagel in his locker. One of them punches him in the nose, and they all collectively beat him up. There's this moment where one of the bullies, basically, Sammy had seen one of the bullies' girlfriends, or one of the bullies, Logan, kissing another girl. So he admits to the girlfriend basically that he saw her boyfriend, Logan, cheating with someone else. And that kind of causes a rift in their relationship. So Logan basically bullies Sammy into meeting with the girlfriend privately and just telling her that everything he said was a lie. So we have this great scene where he meets with them, and not only does he talk to Logan's girlfriend, but also to her friend, Monica. And immediately Sammy hits it off with this Monica, a very proud, Jesus-loving person who, under the pretense and maybe in some ways genuine attempts to proselytize Sammy and encourage him to kind of prey on his Jewishness, invites him back to her house, and they begin a relationship and become boyfriend and girlfriend. Back home, just to fill out this sort of section, we see Mitzi at home has become a little bit more unstable and unhappy happy in this home. She's bought a monkey that's terrorizing their home that she's decided to name Benny. And Bert has become increasingly concerned and is suggesting her and encouraging to her that she maybe consider therapy.
Well, that's what we do, right? When the shit hits the fan, get a monkey. I think that's how you solve all of your problems.
More shit will hit the fan, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Quite literally. I mean, I love the introduction to Monica. I thought she was so funny, and she added such levity to an otherwise kind of darker part of the movie. Kudos to Sammy, though, for initially kind of like sticking up for himself and not taking any guff from Logan or from Chad. Yeah, I mean, that was sort of like the first really sort of, yeah, that was, aside from like this otherness that they were experiencing earlier in the movie, this is the first, sort of picture of anti-Semitism, that comes up with the Bagelman. I think it's like first he gets teased in the locker room, and then they show the bagel, they call him a Jew hole or something like that. And, I think, yeah, Monica kind of saving it with, bringing some levity and kind of saving him. And also, her whole thing was just great. I loved her.
Yeah, I think in some ways, like what you're saying, this is probably the most explicitly Jewish, where Jewishness is really centered in the film. But it really does remind me of what you were talking about in the beginning, Esther, where it's not marked in a necessarily positive way, but it's in isolation. Him and his siblings are the only Jews in this school. Like, people make a big deal over, like, wow, you're Jewish, and are shocked by it. They start accusing him or demanding that he apologizes for killing Jesus. Like,
oh yeah,
his Jewishness really stands in opposition. And I don't know if we get any empowered Jewish expression that kind of is born out of this, more so than really just we see him bullied on account of his Jewishness, and we get to see this anti-Semitism up close and in his face.
One of the things that I'm just kind of thinking about now is the 3 locations that we have for the Fabelman family. We've got New Jersey, where presumably there was more than one Jewish family, even if they weren't on in his block, because we didn't really see the anti-Semitic thing there that much or at all. Then Arizona, where we also didn't really see it, as far as I can recall. But it also wasn't a factor in how he lived his life. And then in Northern California, this is a place where I think there weren't a lot of Jews, and so he was automatically both outsider and a little bit exoticized. And when I typed the word exoticization in my notes, it changed it to eroticization, which is not far off. It's not what I wanted to say, autocorrect, but it is also in there, which is, just that this person who was so different from everybody else became a little bit of a sex object. And that was new for him too, but must have been really challenging to have that kind of interest at the same time as the bullying and, actual physical danger and physical excitement kind of together is just a very hard package for him to, I said hard package. Okay. Anyway, the point is, it's just a kind of, those are 2 tensions that are sometimes difficult to hold at the same time.
Sure. So, yeah. I mean, I remember Monica and Logan's girlfriend were quite tickled with the fact that he's talking about circumcisions. I feel like it came up somehow in the conversation, and they were just tee and super, intrigued, like you're saying, about his Jewish persuasion. And I think you're totally spot on with that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the circumcision, you reminded me of a line that happens, I think, in a later scene, but someone asks him since when are you Jewish or something? And he said, since my circumcision.
Oh, that's what it is. Yeah.
What he really does in these scenes to me adopts this very quippy, smart alecky, and what we've, I think in previous episodes, Daniel called a very sort of Jewish kind of, New York smartassy kind of, exactly, that type of humor. And he really leans into this in a lot of these later scenes. And partly because he's this othered character and he's just fighting back with his words when we see characters who are so much bigger than him. The first scene we're introduced to of this in this high school is when they're playing volleyball, and he looks like he's 4 years younger than everyone else there because they're all, much taller, much more muscular. And it really makes him stand out. The one other thing I wanted to mention, Esther, was you were talking about how he's moving, in every leg of the journey, it's like Steven Spielberg is moving further away from, an ostensibly Jewish community towards one that is becoming much more anti-Semitic. And I just think the irony here is if you continue the film beyond, Northern California, obviously the next stop is Hollywood, it's Los Angeles. And in some ways, there really is he finds his tribe finally, and he finds, a group, which we know at the time Hollywood, and remains there are very large Jewish communities that are living out there. And it's almost like the further he's being pushed away from, Jersey, it's ultimately towards something, and ultimately community and isolation from other Jews, or ultimately it's isolation from other Jews that kind of pushes him towards finding this community, this artistic film community that always spoke to him for a number of reasons.
I think that culturally that's very accurate. I think in terms of observant Judaism, in the same book that I mentioned before, this Stars of David book, which I think is 2007, I don't remember, something around there. Mm-hmm. He talks about how what brought him back to his actual Jewish identity, beyond culturally Jewish, or, knowing that the Holocaust was important, or all those things, is when his wife, Kate Capshaw, converted to Judaism when they were getting married. Like, he kind of returned to it then to accompany her on that journey. And that was when he felt like reconnected, which I think is also just a beautiful story about the value, which we see in some ways. I'm hesitating to make this comparison, but, the Monica character is a woman of faith who, kind of makes him more Jewish, even though that's not necessarily her intention. Right. And I wonder if that echo is an intentional, or if I'm just reading it in. So,
I mean, this is the place to do it. This is Stretch City right here. Totally.
It makes sense. I mean, she's also the one, and we're going to describe it in the next scene, and hopefully this will set you up, Daniel, but she's also the one that reintroduces him into filmmaking and pulls him back towards it. All of her attempts to, maybe help him see the light, they're ultimately very successful, just maybe not in the direction she's going in, but in the direction of finding faith again, right? He finds his faith in his Jewishness, so to speak. I mean, we don't see all that explicitly, but he definitely finds his faith again in filmmaking and in telling stories and in viewing his life through a camera. So I think in some ways she really can be credited with pulling him towards that.
Nice. Yeah. I think, thank you for the segue, Harry. Let's, moving on, as you mentioned, Monica is invited over to the Fabelman families for a meal, where everyone's kind of like yelling at each other and arguing. And that's when Mitzi delivers her line of, it's the artists versus the engineers, and, and the monkeys running around and everything. And, she really does a nice thing. Monica, says, oh, my dad has an Aeroflex 16 millimeter camera. For those keeping track at home, I think this is the third or the fourth camera that Sammy is now, leveled up at, because, although Benny bought him a Bolex, he turned in his old camera and has put it away and has not used his Bolex up until this point. So he borrows the 16 millimeter camera from Monica to film the senior ditch day, because they're looking to have some photographers there and to capture the moment where everyone hangs out at the beach and does games and all sorts of stuff. Later on, though, Sammy's parents tell the children that they're getting divorced, so Mitzi can go back to Phoenix and be with Benny the human, not Benny the monkey. The kids get super upset, and Sammy imagines himself he sees himself kind of in the mirror filming that exchange. Monica and Sammy go to prom, and there is a cute montage here of them filming the ditch day, but we'll get into the details of that in a second. But, Monica and Sammy go to prom. He gives her like a nice... is it a corset? Is that the little flower thing? Corsage. Thank you. Yeah, the corset's anyway.
Yeah.
So
not a present.
No. Yeah. Monica and Sammy go to prom, where Sammy gives Monica a corsage, and he asks her to move to LA with him. And I think on the corsage is like a crucifix, saying that he loves her and mentioning that his parents are also divorced. And she tells him, we can't fix things all the time. We sometimes have to suffer. She also calls him out, and she's like, how could you possibly love me? You've only known me for a few months. But Sammy presents his ditch day film, and the students love it. I mean, it's a work of art. Everyone loves it. Logan is kind of overwhelmed by the positive, golden boy perspective that Sammy has given him through the magic of editing. And then I think Chad, meanwhile, sort of the real sub bully, if you want to call him that, is portrayed as like a buffoon in the film, and he gets royally pissed off. And there's a really nice scene, which we'll talk about in a second, in the hallway. So back home, Sammy's mother asks for forgiveness and says, you have to do what your heart says. And so we'll kind of pause here right before the next sort of section and kind of talk about prom and things like that. And really talk about Sammy's magnum opus film, which is the Ditch Day film. Any thoughts on what we covered up until this point?
Yeah, you mentioned that Monica line that she says to him, that sometimes we can't fix things, sometimes we have to suffer. And that really is, I think, the progression that we've seen Sammy going on, where he's recognized that with his art. And it's all the observation we were saying about how it's not so much about controlling. Controlling doesn't mean, and it can't mean, changing and fixing his parents' marriage and fixing all of his relationships and, making the bullies like him. But what it can do is just help him see the narrative, or see through a different perspective, own the narrative a little bit more, process. And filmmaking for him, seemingly at this point becomes about processing. I would say in the actual Ditch Day film, we see the first instances of a little bit of trickery. We had this great moment when they were filming it on the beach, where we saw these students pouring ice cream on their fellow students' faces, and we didn't understand why they were doing it. And then when we actually see the film, he does this great editing trick where he follows these pigeons flying above them and then cuts to the ice cream falling on their faces, very clearly implying that, these people had pigeon poop on their faces. And I think that was the one instance where I said, okay, you know what? You can use a little bit of trickery. You can. It doesn't always have to be objective truth. He's not a sort of Bazanian realist, so to speak, where he's allowing himself to do some sort of editing tricks here. But I think that's exemplifies this moment of reckoning where he's trying to figure out what can be portrayed on the film. Can it change how he thinks about, or can it change the facts, or can it just give him a new, maybe more lighthearted perspective, or just a more analytical and processing perspective? So I felt like of all of his films, he's really grappling with that the most in this latest one.
The beach scene, it reminded me of Top Gun, which is of course not the reference that he was intending, because Spielberg had nothing to do with Top Gun. But I think that the idea of these kids frolicking on the beach and feeling like they don't have, adult supervision or restriction. It's like a real sense of freedom. And the idea that, one of their own, that a peer was there just kind of capturing it all, but very unobtrusively. He wasn't like directing in the same way that he directed his Boy Scout friend playing the general who had seen his team die in a war. Mm-hmm. He was just kind of like clearly the ice cream scene that you mentioned had to have been orchestrated or directed, but we don't see that happening. And so in a way, it's also like us watching him, watching them. So it's a play in perspective. I was actually thinking over this in my mind to try to figure out like why he's so upset with this golden boy portrayal. And I think that the reason is because that's not how he sees himself. And it disturbs him that anyone could look at him as the ideal, because as we know, bullies often bully because they're uncomfortable with their own state of being. And to make themselves feel better, they beat up on somebody else who is perceived to be of a lower stature or more easy to beat up rather than beat up themselves, which as Jews, we know the best thing to do is beat up ourselves because, that's
right.
That way it doesn't hurt anybody except us. So I think it's a really interesting thing that Sammy did with his camera, is show him a part of and show both him and Chad the way another person could see them. And I think it's interesting that the two are so differently portrayed because they were both bullies, but clearly, Chad is the obnoxious a-hole, and Logan is kind of just like brutish, maybe misunderstood, and feels like he needs to teach Sammy a lesson because of the girlfriend situation that he oversaw, that he fied on accidentally. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, I think it's just interesting to watch the perspectives of, again, people see themselves through Sammy Fabelman's lens, and whether or not they like the truths that are portrayed in that way.
Yeah. I mean, even in the reaction shots of this film, which had like great reaction shots, but then we are treated to reaction shots, like you said, Esther, of like the guy who's getting like seagull shit on his face. Like there were a few of them in the audience and they're like, yeah, that's me. I got ice cream on my face. And they're just like loving it. And meanwhile, like Chad, who's like trying to sneak up on a girl and like take her soda pop and sit next to her, and she pulls the blanket away. Then we cut to his reaction shot and he's kind of not too happy about it. And, you know, I think this sort of hallway scene where Sammy is at first kind of like sitting on the floor, you know, after the screening is over, he's disappeared. He's sitting on the floor, kind of like moping in the hallway. And then Logan finds him. And like you said, Esther talks to him about, why'd you portray me this way and things like that. And then, you know, I think there's almost a position switch because Logan ends up sitting on the floor, right? Or does... maybe. And then he gets up and offers him a joint and then leaves. But there's just, yeah, it's very interesting because now Sammy kind of has this power over Logan where he can take down the fiercest bully with his filmmaking trickery and kind of mock him in front of all the people using his art and things like that, which I thought was really, really too bad we didn't get to see like Sammy Fabelman high, though. I would have really enjoyed some maybe like kind of interesting film psychedelia, but oh well, maybe for the next one.
The film continues. We actually jump ahead, and 1 year later, Sammy is living with his dad, and we witness him coming home from school and having a panic attack because he hates what he's doing in school. He just wants to be making film, and he's trying to make film, but he's repeatedly getting rejected by a bunch of studios. So his dad calms him down. He makes him some tea, and he ultimately, over the course of their conversation, I think more so than we've seen throughout the movie, gets to a place where he's willing to even reluctantly say, if you need to drop out, you could do it. Go for it. He ends up handing Sammy a letter that he received, one of the letters that Sammy hadn't opened yet. Sammy opens it, finds it's from CBS, and they invite him to come in and interview. So then we have this great final scene where he goes to the interview, and the interviewer, after talking to him for a little bit and telling him about the new show, Hogan's Heroes, that he's going to be an assistant for, he tells him very excitedly, the interviewer, oh, do you want to meet the greatest director of all time? And basically marches him across the office to wait for who we ultimately find out is John Ford, obviously one of Sammy's heroes, the director of the Liberty Valance film that we saw at the very beginning of the movie, one of the initial inspirations for Sammy. And we just have this great scene where Ford basically gives him a lesson in horizons and just tells him, you know, here's my lesson to you. If the horizon is in the bottom of the frame, if it's on the top of the frame, that's interesting. If it's in the middle, it's not. And then sends him out of his office. And Sammy is delighted by this encounter, walks out smiling. And, you know, as we know from the true story, it goes on to become one of, if not the most important directors of all time. And that's where the film ends.
Or does it?
Bum, bum, right. Bum. Meet the Fabelmans 2 coming next year.
It's where I thought it was going. You know, I felt like, I mean, because a part of it, again, is because we know whose story this is. Like, we know what happened to him. You're not going to like get that, you know, that layover text at the end being like, Steven Spielberg went on to become one of the greatest directors of all time. He married this is Mitzi Fabelman, blah, blah, blah. Is, you know, you're not going to get all that biographical stuff that goes on at the end of a biopic, because these are not those people. They are characters. But because the characters are following along the train tracks, if you will, set up by Spielberg, that then you know where it's going to go, that he's going to, you know, maybe you don't know if it's John Ford or whoever did the movie with the train. Was it
Cecil B. DeMille? Yeah.
So, like, you know, that's where I thought it was going. Oh, he's going to meet Cecil B. DeMille because that's going to be the callback. But it was a different callback. But it's, you know, I think that was where we all knew he was going to go. It's where he ended up. And then, you know, he's in Hollywood, and that's whoever, whether he's Spielberg or whether he's every director who's ever traveled a trajectory like that, this is where he lands, and among the sound stages. So.
Yeah, I think it's almost more exciting, like we were saying in the beginning, not mapping it onto Steven Spielberg and not knowing where it goes. I love this as a very self-contained, not biopic, just coming of age story. And there's something very victorious about the fact that we don't see him when he's winning his Oscar or directing his big film. But for him, just getting the permission from his father and just the connection and the ability to commit his life to film and to tell the stories he always wanted to, the one thing that was clearly more important than anything else, just getting to start on that path is such a victory that I almost love that the movie ends like that. And if this wasn't the Steven Spielberg, would be so satisfied that this was a great movie. He gets to start this journey. Who knows if he's going to be super successful or a producer or, an assistant for the next 30 years. To me, that almost doesn't matter. And I know that's a little bit ridiculous to say in a story that's so fundamentally about the Steven Spielberg epic, but I think this movie is so successful because the story works even without the Spielberg future and even without the title, like you were saying over the screen, that says he would go on to become one of the most celebrated directors of all time. Like I love this as it's a great punctuation mark on the Sammy Fabelman coming of age story.
I think a couple of things I wanted to point out with this last chunk. We do get some closure on Mitzi's, sort of future, so to speak, because in addition to kind of like leafing through the mail and finding the CBS letter, Sammy also does get some photos in the mail. So he's kind of looking at some photos of Mitzi and Benny kind of enjoying their barbecue in Phoenix with the kids. And so it's, we have kind of tied that story element into like a nice bow that his sisters are raised in Phoenix and he's attending school. Shout out to Cal State Long Beach, which is where Steven Spielberg went and then I think transferred to USC. But, got to give shout outs to the Cal State system while we can, because I went to Cal State Northridge, as everyone knows. Not really. I just love this sort of reveal of the John Fordness of it all. We kind of meet the toughened secretary who kind of gets probably people like this all the time coming to her office. And so we just see her and him, and there's this kind of fun interplay. And then we hear the Liberty Valance music and we just kind of pan over to all these different posters and things like that. And really cool, fun cameo by David Lynch. It took me a second to realize who it was. I loved it all. But as I mentioned, I would have loved to see a little bit more of Steven Spielberg's early career. He did look, by the way, like a dead ringer of early Steven Spielberg with this sort of wig that he was wearing. He kind of had the Steven Spielberg look down. And I would have appreciated some photos during the credits of Steven Spielberg's childhood and maybe some pictures of him like on set and maybe a picture of him and his mom, or maybe even at the restaurant at the Milky Way or some fun elements like that to kind of tie it together, even though it is a different thing. Whew. So this is a lot. And I want to take a breather here, take a quick break, and we'll come back, Esther, and we will rate the film on a scale of 1 to 5 Jewish stars based on content, themes, and cast and crew. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Jews on Film. We're discussing Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans, and now we're going to rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 Jewish stars. So, Daniel, why don't you get us started talking about some of the content, cast, crew, themes, all the above?
Sure, absolutely. We didn't really touch on it too much about the cast and the crew in terms of their Jewishness, but we'll dissect it a little bit here. Obviously Spielberg is Jewish. Tony Kushner is Jewish. John Williams and Janusz Kaminski, I can't speak to their Jewishness. But in the cast, we have Seth Rogen and Judd Hirsch, who are Jewish. And I believe Michelle Williams is raising her kids Jewish, is what I heard. I don't know more background on that, but maybe Esther could fill us in on that. But, so that's for cast and crew. Content, it's a coming of age story. There are Jewish elements to it. We have the Uncle Boris. We have the anti-Semitism that presents itself. We have the Hanukkah lighting at the beginning. No davening, no rabbis, no kippahs. I didn't see any mezuzahs on the door, and we even saw mezuzahs in Clueless. So just
I think there were mezuzahs.
There was?
No,
okay.
I definitely noticed a couple.
You did? Okay. Mezuzah. Okay. I retract my mezuzah comment then. Themes, I think, is really where a lot of my score is going to be sitting, because there's sprinkles of content. Themes, we have things, anti-Semitism, otherness, this idea of like having like a multi-generational family, I feel like is kind of not necessarily a Jewish thing, but, having the bubbies around, I think, for all the meals and all the different holidays. So I think I've seen more Jewish films and I've seen less Jewish films, but wanted to see, Esther, how you sort of felt about the Jewishness of this film, not the quality, but sort of using our kind of kooky rubric. Where did you feel like this film landed?
Yes, a kooky rubric indeed. I always want things to be more Jewy. That's like one of the things I talk about, especially when it's true to the environment of the film. And I liked the like I said, the Hanukkah candle lighting, I think was really right on the money. I was trying to figure out when I was watching it whether they were lighting it from the right side or not. And like it's really hard because it was fast and
right.
And also because the way the camera flips, sometimes if they're on the other side of it, they could be lighting it the correct way. And then the camera is just showing us them lighting it the wrong way. So like, I didn't really get too bogged down in that. I didn't let it ruin the movie for me or anything. But I definitely liked the fact that the Judaism was kind of peppered in. And it seems like that's very true to the environment that they're trying to create, and true to the Spielberg experience of Judaism when he was growing up as well. So I don't think. Like for me, I always want more Jewiness in there. I always want Judaism to be a source of meaning rather than conflict, a source of acceptance and community rather than othering. But I understand that othering makes more dramatic content than acceptance and love. But that's kind of how I feel about the Jewishness of it.
Harry, how about yourself?
The movie has a lot of Jewish content in it. I think that's really where it shines as a sort of Jewish film. I mean, it's all on the surface. You don't have to go looking very long. We talked about the Hanukkah scenes in the beginning, and every instance with the mezuzahs, and just their identity as a Jewish family is not subtext, it's text. It's there, right? We see, we hear it in their speech. And you mentioned, Daniel, they have dinners with their generations of bubbies, and people are working in Yiddish and just talking a certain way and talking about holiday, and just there's so much Jewishness, shockingly high. And I agree with everything you're saying, Esther, about it being not necessarily a positive representation so much as this crutch that I think he's dealing with a little bit. I mean, in some ways, it lays the framework for the movie, right? Uncle Boris, there's no explanation or just, oh, he's Jewish and they don't make a big deal of it. That's true to the story. He had an uncle who was very Jewish. His family grew up Jewish. He probably really did have that. I mean, we spoke about it. He did have that conversation with his father about how their house wasn't lit up. So there's so much Jewishness in the content because that's just true to the story. And I think that backs the narrative that we get. Thematically, I actually didn't see it as much because I don't think that the Jewishness of the story, or there's any sort of Jewish themes that are really driving a lot of the progression of the characters, a lot of the growth, the momentum. I think we've uncovered a lot of different things that, themes that are running through the film, questions about, nature versus science versus art, and nature versus control, and questions. And I think there's Jewish reads to be had for all of those, right? When we were talking about control and being a filmmaker, I was thinking about that concept of creation and being that observant God and not weighing in, but just kind of taking the step back. I mean, so much of that I think can be connected to his Jewishness. But when the film is simultaneously so Jewish in its content, the fact that it doesn't, I think, make the effort to point out the relationship between maybe his Jewishness and his desire to create, his desire to observe, his desire to connect emotionally with his world the way he does, that makes it feel even more stark. Like I'll say to you, Daniel, I think in the past we've had episodes that maybe weren't ostensibly Jewish and said, well, thematically you can really tie this in. Mm-hmm. But because this film is so Jewish in its content, the fact that it's not explicit thematically makes me feel like I don't feel like it's necessary to give this movie such a high Jewish ranking in terms of its themes, because I don't really see it so strongly. So I think that's going to weigh into my score.
Counterpoint?
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to hear it.
I hadn't really thought about this again when I was watching the film, but now that I'm thinking about all the journey that we've just been on today, I feel like there is some wandering Jewness happening. The family does move around. They go where the jobs are. They they always have them, their own family unit. And in a very real sense, there were a couple of scenes that are shot in the desert, and there is that kind of moving from the place, it felt like Abraham, go from your homeland, where your birthplace, to the place that I'll show you. And, when we get there, that's kind of when you'll get there. And so I think that journey is something that, and there's a reason that the journey of Abraham is so core to several different faiths, is because this idea of journeying toward a goal that is out there, but you can't quite see. And just taking that kind of leap of faith is something that people used to do, because they didn't know they had a job offer. They didn't know what it was going to be like. And they just went because they were called there by a higher power who happened to be the CEO of a company.
Right.
So I think that there's some of that. I think that like we've covered about the exoticizing and the otherness and the outsiderness, that very much, I think, is a story that many Jewish families are familiar with. The classic, are we insiders, are we outsiders? And that's something that as a very small population of America, as a very small population of micro population of the planet, there is, as we know from recent conversations, that there's a very large group of people who believe that we are legion, and we are not. We're a tiny bunch of pipsqueaks who happen to, sometimes receive the messages that we should go out and achieve for stability's sake, not for the sake of achievement, but to make a difference in the world. And I think that some of that is in here too, is that he feels very early on that the way he can make a difference is by sharing these perspectives and sharing these stories. And so that's what he is moving toward, but he doesn't quite know what the road is.
Whoa, mic drop. That was awesome. I don't even have anything. Yeah, that was great. I feel like no notes. That was
Wow.
terrific. No, yeah.
I feel like impromptu Dvar Torah.
Totally. No, I think one thing I wanted to add is just like, as we're kind of digging in, like this idea of like just learning, and like Talmud Chacham, like being a wise student, a student of life, a student of the craft, constantly leveling up. I don't know necessarily that's a specific Jewish value, but this idea of learning and getting better and learning from other people and just constantly trying to be better, bettering yourself, bettering your art, things like that, I think kind of will weigh into my score. But I see Harry, you want to just add something in real quick?
Yeah, I did love the point that you were making. I think I'm wondering, it made me think just about Sammy and his journey, right? And comparing him to that, to the character, to the figure of Abraham, because he's not, I don't know if he's really driving his journey so much the same way. And I don't want to call him passive. I mean, that's perceived as a criticism level to protagonists, but I think that when you were finishing your point, you made the point that he doesn't know where his journey's going. He's just following along. And that really feels like how he navigated through these moves, right? Bert, his father, of course, is the one who prompted each move. But in every scene, it almost feels like we're following Sammy as he's trying to place himself, trying to navigate it. And the one area he's always able to is with his movies, right? He uses the power of the book, of the film to always, we get all these reaction shots. Every time he puts on a movie in a new place, you get, whether it's the amazement of his family or of his Boy Scouts or of the school, he's able to kind of pull himself out of there and anchor himself with his film. But the journey itself almost feels reluctant to me. Like he grows from it. He learns, his filmmaking gets better, but wandering is a better word for it, which I know you mentioned, because that's really how it feels. It's very aimless. It's very, it's one step at a time. But I don't know. I have more thoughts about just how he's using his art to kind of bring people into his world, share context. I mean, that's all there. I'm not seeing it as much. I'm trying to make sense of where that fits in with his Jewishness. And if that's clear, and maybe if that could have been clearer for me to consider this to feel more explicitly Jewish. Because when I think of the Jewishness of the film, I think of him being bullied as by anti-Semitic people and him suffering because of his Jewishness. I'm looking for the liberation that comes through his Jewishness, and I'm only seeing it through his film, and I'm struggling to put that connection together, I think.
When a person encounters another person's art, right? The person who made the art had a set of intentions. They had things that they wanted to show. They had their own interpretation of what ended up on the screen or the wall or of the pedestal or whatever the story is. And then it goes to a movie theater or a stage theater or a museum, and then people encounter it and make their own assessments and do their own interpretations. And that's what we're doing here, and I think that what we're doing, and what I think film criticism, I think conversations on podcasts, I think blogs, I think all of these things that have comment sections, I think they're all about central texts and side commentary, and about people arguing about what the intent of the author was. And I think that is something that we're doing that is making this film even more Jewy than it would have been before.
Good call.
So even if there's not like a lot of, you don't see his journey as being an outgrowth of his Judaism. But our experience of the movie is an outgrowth of our Jewish lens that we are applying to this. And so I don't know if Steve is listening, but if he is, maybe he'll tell us if we got it. But he might not listen to this episode. I don't know why. But he might not listen to this episode. And if he doesn't, that'll be okay. We have to live in this space where we don't know what his intention was unless he gives another it gives an interview to the Jewish Journal or something like that. But I think that we bring our own lens to it. And if our lens is Jewish in orientation or in influence, then we are likely to see things that may or may not have been his intent.
I think we're going to have to cut that together as a trailer for this podcast, because I love the way you said all that. And I totally agree. I mean, that's the exercise. We're reading our Jewish lens onto it. And
sure,
I think in some places we uncover the gold mines of look at how this fits in. Sometimes we don't see as much as we're expecting. And that's just, that's the game. And I love it. And I love it.
Thanks for pointing that out.
I welcome our different opinions. Exactly.
Totally. Thank you. I hadn't thought about it that way, that what we're doing is in its way kind of like Talmudic and discussing it in having differences of opinions. So Steven, if you are listening, now would be a great time to pause and skip ahead, because we are going to give this film a rating of 1 to 5 Jewish stars. Esther, you're our guest. Would you like to go first?
This is really hard. I don't like rating things. Those surveys that you get after an event asking you if it was satisfactory or unsatisfactory on a scale of 1 to 5. I usually pick a middle number unless I'm really offended or I really loved it. So I think that's my approach.
Rest assured, we're rating the Jewishness, not the quality. So if you want to just, for the record, give it the 5 out of 5 stars quality and then get to the Jewishness, maybe that'll help you rest easy.
Well, in terms of the Jewishness, from 1 to 5 Jewish stars, I think I'm going to go with a 3.5.
Great.
I feel like there were really some solid moments in there that we talked about, and that it was definitely part of the family history and made sure that we knew that it was part of the family history. There were a couple of good rituals in there. You said you saw some mezuzahs. I don't know that I clocked them, but I think the ripping of the clothing for Kriya, for the morning ritual, I thought was definitely present and visible and made an impact. So yeah, I would say 3.5.
It's all good. I think for me, I probably join you, Esther, in that 3.5 zone, because, it's more Jewish than it's not Jewish. It's not quite 5 stars. It's a coming of age story, like you said, with Jewish elements peppered in. So I might sit there with you at the 3.5 area. Harry, how about yourself?
It's like so objectively Jewish. Like I have to remove myself from the conversation we've had, not all of it, but from a lot of the conversation we've just had, because in some ways I'm fighting with myself over how thematically Jewish it is. But I think if you ask anyone, or if you ask people in 5 years, what was Steven Spielberg's most Jewish film? Like, of course it's this one. There's so much Jewishness in it. This is the Jewish family unit. Like, it's all there. I think I wanted more, and I wanted more of the Jewishness to be not just the context that in some ways I felt like he was almost running away from, but I really wanted it to be part of the punchline, part of the emotional growth, the journey towards film. And I wanted that so badly. And because I think I haven't picked it up yet, but maybe on rewatch, I'll get there. Maybe, you know, after thinking about this for another couple of days, I'll get there. But because it wasn't there, you know, it pains me to do this, but I'm still going to have to go a little lower than I wanted to. I'm still going to give it 3, right? It has to be above 2.5 because this is such a Jewish movie. It'd be comical if I called this like a 1 and said, you know, any of the other movies we've done was more Jewish than this, because it's so Jewish. But I think it's part of just, you know, whatever the last conversation we've had where we're getting in this, that I can't give it higher. So for now, it's a 3. Maybe I'll revisit it sooner, but I'm going to come in on the lower end this time.
Sounds good. Okay, so Steven, now you can turn it back on because it's time for Esther to give her plug. So Esther, thank you so much for being here on Jews on Film. I wanted to ask if there's anything you'd like to plug or promote for our listeners.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for hosting me here today.
Yeah.
This is really such a delight. Like I said, I don't get a lot of opportunity to go deep into movies anymore. So I was really grateful for this opportunity. So in terms of me, I'm available on the internet in various spaces. You can reach me on Twitter still for now, at Esther K. I still believe in the power of Twitter, so I'm not giving it up so quickly. We'll see how well that statement ages in the next couple of months.
Right.
On Instagram, I'm Esther Kustanowitz, which you can find, you know, by correctly spelling my name, which you can find by Googling me or by looking at Esther K on Twitter. The Bagel Report is also on Facebook and on Instagram. Facebook, it's The Bagel Report. And on Instagram, it's TBR The Pod.
Nice.
So that's our social media presence. In terms of my own stuff, I'm working on a lot of projects that have to do with Jewish representation on film. The Bagel Report is one of them. That is my podcast with Aaron Ben Moshe that we've been doing for upwards of 80 something episodes.
Wow.
And we talk about Jews and popular culture and some film, but a lot of TV, some music. And we talk about all the stories that intersect in those two spaces. And it's been real fun. And we've gotten a couple of awards, and we are moving into some interesting spaces in January, and we'll hope to have more on that soon. But we're really looking forward to the year ahead because it's going to be really super, super fun. And I also write a column occasionally in the J, which is the Jewish News of Northern California, where I write about TV. In addition to that, I write at eJewish Philanthropy about Jewish philanthropy, and I've a freelancer who has written in a lot of other places. So that's my long spiel. You can find me anywhere, writing about Jewy things. And I have a project called TV Gone Jewy, where I talk about that stuff too. So really, if you are interested in the intersection between Jews and popular culture, I have any number of outlets for you.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put all of that stuff into the show notes so people can kind of reach out to you and, you know, consume your content however they'd like in all the various forms. But yeah, really, thank you so much for coming along this long journey to kind of discuss this amazing film that we saw in theaters, which is awesome.
Yeah. Imagine that.
Yeah. Anything for you to plug, sir?
Just keep seeing movies, keep going to theaters to see movies. And it was such a pleasure having you on, Esther.
Thank you. Thank you both for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks everyone for listening to Jews on Film, the podcast. You can check us out on all the social medias at Instagram, on Twitter, on TikTok, on YouTube. And, if you haven't seen this film and you've listened to the podcast this far, thank you. But if there's other Spielberg films you want us to check out or any thoughts about the film, feel free to reach out to us and let us know. You can email us at jewsonfilmpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye. Jews on Film is hosted and produced by Harry Ottensasser and Daniel Zana. And Harry edited this episode. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Jews on Film and subscribe to our podcast to get new episodes. Thanks for listening.